Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history, from Stillwater Ridge, Pennsylvania. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The year was 1959 when local newspapers first reported strange occurrences in the isolated community of Stillwater Ridge, a small neighborhood nestled in the eastern foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. The development had been constructed in 1954 by Meridian Housing Corporation, marketed as an idyllic suburban retreat for middle-class couples looking to escape the growing chaos of larger cities. With its circular layout featuring a single access road that branched into 7 cul-de-sacs, each with 6 identical houses, Stillwater Ridge appeared unremarkable on architectural plans. Property records indicate that all 42 homes sold within 3 months of completion. The sales brochures emphasized privacy, security, and a community-minded approach to modern living, with unusually affordable pricing for homes of that quality and location. What these brochures failed to highlight, however, was the peculiar covenant that came with property ownership in Stillwater Ridge, a restriction that would later become the focal point of numerous disturbing incidents. What made Stillwater Ridge unusual wasn't its appearance, but rather Municipal Ordinance 37B, which was discreetly included in all homeowner contracts. The ordinance stated that no resident shall exit the neighborhood boundaries between sunset and sunrise under any circumstances. According to county archives, the restriction was initially presented as a simple security measure. Prospective homeowners were told it was meant to discourage criminal activity and maintain property values. Those who inquired further were assured by the sales representatives that the rule was merely a formality, rarely enforced and primarily designed to prevent unauthorized wandering in the surrounding woods at night. The original sales team employed by Meridian Housing seemed particularly skilled at downplaying the significance of this restriction, often framing it as a charming eccentricity that contributed to the community's unique character and close-knit nature. The first documented incident occurred on October 17, 1959, when Augustine Mercer, a 42-year-old accountant residing at 7 Oakwood Circle, attempted to drive to the hospital after his wife Vivian began experiencing severe chest pains shortly after 9:30 p.m. According to the official police report filed the next morning, Mercer's vehicle was found abandoned approximately 50 yards beyond the neighborhood entrance sign. Neither Augustine nor Vivian was ever located. Their disappearance was ultimately attributed to voluntary departure in the official records, despite the fact that their personal belongings, including clothing and family photographs, remained in their home. The investigators noted that dinner had been left half-eaten on the dining table, and Vivian's purse containing her wallet and identification was still hanging by the front door, details inconsistent with planned departure. Curiously, none of the neighbors reported hearing or seeing anything unusual that night. When interviewed by Detective Victor Sloan, residents uniformly stated they had all been asleep early. The homes on either side of the Mercers' residence claimed to have heard nothing. No car engine, no raised voices, nothing that would indicate distress. The case file notes that Detective Sloan found this collective silence unnaturally consistent, but no further investigation was pursued after his supervisor reassigned him to other cases. What the official report omitted, however, was information discovered decades later in Sloan's personal journal. He had written about finding peculiar marks on the pavement where Mercer's car had been abandoned, not tire tracks or skid marks, but what he described as elongated indentations approximately 2 inches deep, as though something extraordinarily heavy had walked around the vehicle. He also noted finding a strange residue on the car's exterior that resembled viscous mucus but evaporated within minutes of exposure to daylight, leaving no trace for lab analysis. In the months that followed, real estate listings show that the Mercer house remained vacant for nearly a year before selling for 30% below market value to a couple named Donovan. According to the Stillwater Ridge Homeowner Association minutes from April 1960, residents unanimously voted to enact a more formal enforcement protocol for Ordinance 37B, including mandatory community meetings at sunset and sunrise during the summer months. The minutes specifically reference the unfortunate Mercer situation and note that proper adherence to community guidelines could have prevented unnecessary complications. What's particularly disturbing about these minutes is the clinical, almost euphemistic language used to describe what was essentially the disappearance and presumed death of two community members. The document outlines new enforcement measures, including a system of warning bells to be rung 30 minutes before sunset, a neighborhood patrol consisting of 3 designated residents each night, and a support protocol for emergencies that might tempt residents to leave after dark. The minutes also mention the acquisition of necessary emergency medical equipment to be stored in a centrally located shed, accessible to designated community members with medical training, suggesting a deliberate preparation for situations like the one that had precipitated the Mercers' disappearance. The community's peculiar nighttime restrictions might have remained a footnote in local history, were it not for the journalistic curiosity of Harriet Whitmore from the regional newspaper, the Eastern Sentinel. In August 1963, Whitmore began investigating unusual patterns in emergency service calls after a colleague mentioned that ambulances and police vehicles were explicitly instructed never to enter Stillwater Ridge after dark. According to her personal notes discovered decades later in the newspaper's archive storage, Whitmore found that despite housing over 150 residents, Stillwater Ridge had recorded 0 emergency calls between sunset and sunrise for nearly 5 years, a statistical anomaly that defied logical explanation. Whitmore's investigation extended to county hospital records, where she discovered another disturbing pattern. Residents of Stillwater Ridge who sought medical treatment invariably did so during daylight hours, regardless of when their symptoms began. In several cases, patients had endured serious medical events, such as suspected heart attacks or broken bones throughout the night, only seeking treatment after sunrise. When questioned about these delays, patients provided vague explanations about not wanting to disturb neighbors or preferring to wait for morning, responses that medical staff had noted as unusual but not alarming enough to warrant further inquiry. On September 12, 1963, Whitmore drove to Stillwater Ridge, timing her arrival for late afternoon. Her notepad entries indicate she conducted informal interviews with several residents who appeared pleasantly evasive regarding the community's nighttime procedures. As dusk approached, she described a subtle but noticeable tension emerging among the people she observed, curtains drawing closed and outdoor activities abruptly ceasing. At 6:43 p.m., according to her watch notation, a simple handheld bell was rung by an elderly man standing at the neighborhood's central green space. Within minutes, the streets emptied completely. Whitmore observed that the transition happened with remarkable efficiency, as though extensively practiced. Her notes describe the process as having the precision of a military operation combined with the casualness of a daily routine. Or speak, with residents exchanging brief nods or hand signals as they retreated to their respective homes. Most disturbing was her observation that several residents appeared to glance in her direction with expressions she described as pitying. Whitmore's notes become increasingly fragmented after this point. She wrote about deciding to remain in her parked car near the neighborhood exit to observe what happened after dark. Her final legible entry, time-stamped 8:17 p.m., reads, "Something isn't right about the air here. It feels thicker somehow. The streetlights should have come on by now, but they haven't. There's movement between the houses, but not normal movement, not walking, more like I can't describe it. Wait, someone's approaching my car. The remainder of the page contains what appears to be hurried, nearly illegible scrawling that handwriting experts later suggested was consistent with writing while in motion or under extreme duress. The final words, barely decipherable at the bottom of the page, read, "Not human anymore," followed by what appears to be an incomplete word. The Eastern Sentinel reported Harriet Whitmore missing 3 days later. Her vehicle was discovered at the Brookside Shopping Center, approximately 7 miles from Stillwater Ridge. The car's interior was immaculately clean, with no fingerprints, not even Whitmore's, found on the steering wheel or door handles. The case was investigated as a possible abduction, but no suspects were ever identified. In a disturbing parallel to the Mercer case, residents of Stillwater Ridge uniformly reported having no recollection of any journalist visiting their neighborhood when questioned by authorities. What investigators found particularly confusing was the condition of Whitmore's vehicle. Despite being parked in an unsecured public location for at least 48 hours, the car's interior had been cleaned so thoroughly that forensic technicians described it as sterile. The upholstery showed signs of recent deep cleaning, the windows had been polished inside and out, and even the trunk contained no trace evidence whatsoever, conditions completely inconsistent with normal vehicle abandonment. Most puzzling was the lack of fingerprints belonging to Whitmore herself, suggesting whoever had cleaned the vehicle had done so with extraordinary thoroughness, removing not just evidence of their own presence, but all historical evidence of the car's owner as well. The similarities between the Mercer and Whitmore disappearances prompted Officer Malcolm Reynolds, a junior member of the Sheriff's Department, to request a more thorough investigation of Stillwater Ridge in early 1964. His official request cited suspicious consistency in witness testimony and concerning patterns related to nightfall. Department records indicate his request was denied by Sheriff Walter Hammond, who noted that speculation about local customs does not constitute grounds for investigation. 2 weeks after filing his request, Reynolds resigned from the force. His resignation letter simply stated that he had accepted employment elsewhere, but no record of subsequent employment exists in state databases. The last confirmed sighting of Reynolds was at a gas station approximately 20 miles from Stillwater Ridge on the evening of his resignation. The attendant recalled him appearing agitated and mentioning that he needed to see something for myself before I leave. Reynolds's vehicle was discovered 3 days later, parked on the county road approximately a quarter mile from the Stillwater Ridge entrance. Like Whitmore's car, it had been meticulously cleaned. Unlike Whitmore's case, however, Reynolds's service weapon was found in the trunk, wrapped in a cloth that contained traces of the same unidentifiable residue Detective Sloan had noted on Mercer's vehicle years earlier. What makes this case particularly unsettling is that despite these concerning incidents, Stillwater Ridge continued to function as a seemingly normal community during daylight hours. Adults commuted to jobs throughout the county, and the neighborhood participated in regional events and fundraisers. A 1965 feature in Home and Garden magazine even highlighted Stillwater Ridge as a model community, praising its well-maintained properties and strong sense of traditional values. The article made no mention of Ordinance 37B or the community's strict adherence to sunset curfews. The magazine's spread included numerous photographs of smiling residents, manicured lawns, and community gatherings, all taken during bright daylight hours. The journalist who wrote the piece later mentioned to colleagues that her attempts to schedule an evening visit to observe the community's nightlife had been politely but firmly redirected to morning or afternoon appointments. When she pressed the issue, her contact at Stillwater Ridge explained that residents preferred early dinners and quiet evenings at home, a reasonable explanation that nonetheless contributed to the community's growing reputation for peculiarity. County records from 1966 show an unusual amendment to Stillwater Ridge's original development plan. The neighborhood association, now formally incorporated as the Stillwater Preservation Society, purchased an additional 17 acres of surrounding woodland, effectively increasing the buffer zone between their homes and the nearest neighbor by almost a mile in every direction. The purchase was financed collectively by the residents, with each household contributing an equal portion regardless of property value or income, a remarkable financial consensus rarely seen in community acquisitions. What makes this purchase particularly unusual was the price paid for the land, nearly triple its assessed market value. The seller, a lumber company that had originally planned to harvest the timber, accepted the inflated offer without negotiation. When questioned years later, the former company owner recalled the transaction as the strangest business deal of my career. He described the Stillwater Ridge representatives as unnervingly insistent, explaining that they had approached him repeatedly over several months, increasing their offer each time despite no competing bids for the property. He also mentioned that all meetings took place during morning hours and that the representatives consistently declined his invitations to discuss the matter over dinner. In February 1967, a severe winter storm caused widespread power outages throughout the region. According to utility company logs, repair crews were dispatched to restore service to affected areas, including Stillwater Ridge. The work order, scheduled for 7:30 p.m., notes that crews arrived at the neighborhood entrance but were turned away by a group of residents who insisted they could manage without electricity until morning. The utility supervisor found this refusal unusual enough to document it specifically, writing, "Residents appeared agitated by our presence after dark despite temperatures well below freezing. Spokesman insisted repeatedly that we return after first light and physically blocked road access with several vehicles." What the official report didn't include was the supervisor's personal observation, shared years later, during an interview with a local historian, that the residents who confronted them seemed to be shivering, but not from the cold. He described their movements as twitchy, like they were fighting to hold still, and noted that their speech patterns became increasingly irregular the longer the conversation continued, with unusual pauses and changes in cadence that made communication progressively more difficult. Most disturbing was his recollection that when one of his workers directed a flashlight toward the group, their eyes reflected the light like animals, but with a greenish tint that I've never seen before or since. The following morning, when repair crews returned, they found the neighborhood's electrical system already restored. When questioned, residents explained that several community members had engineering backgrounds and had managed to fix the connection themselves. The utility inspector's report indicates skepticism about this explanation, noting that the repairs performed required specialized equipment not typically available to homeowners. Nevertheless, with service restored, the matter was not pursued further. The inspector did, however, note several unusual observations about the neighborhood in the morning hours. He described the residents as appearing exhausted, with dark circles under their eyes, and mentioned that several homes had blackout curtains visible behind their regular window treatments. Most curiously, he noted a peculiar odor throughout the neighborhood, earthy and mineral like a cave system, but with undertones of something organic and unfamiliar. He also observed that despite the heavy snowfall, there were unusual patterns of tracks between houses, not footprints, but continuous drag marks, as though heavy objects had been pulled across the snow during the night. Throughout the late 1960s, property records show that homes in Stillwater Ridge rarely came up for sale. When they did, they were quickly purchased, often without being publicly listed. Real estate agents serving the broader county area reported that interested buyers were carefully screened by the neighborhood association before being permitted to view available properties. Multiple agents noted that evening or night viewings were categorically refused, with showings strictly limited to between 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. regardless of the season. One agent, Meredith Chambers, recounted a disturbing experience when she accidentally scheduled a showing for 4:30 p.m. in late November, not accounting for the earlier winter sunset. Upon arriving with prospective buyers, she found the seller waiting anxiously by the door, repeatedly checking his watch. As the sun began to set, his demeanor reportedly changed from merely anxious to borderline hostile, and he abruptly ended the showing, practically pushing them out the door while muttering about being late for community obligations. Chambers recalled that as they drove away, she noticed residents emerging from all nearby houses simultaneously, each carrying what appeared to be small leather-bound books. In October 1968, a particularly troubling incident was briefly mentioned in police records. A young couple from a neighboring town reportedly drove into Stillwater Ridge on a dare shortly after midnight. According to their statement, they intended to investigate rumors about the neighborhood's strange nighttime rules that had become something of an urban legend among local youth. The couple's account, documented by Officer Patricia Daniels, describes driving approximately 100 yards past the entrance before their car's electrical system failed completely. They reported seeing shapes moving between houses and hearing a sound like whispering, but from all directions at once. Frightened, they abandoned their vehicle and ran back to the main road, where they flagged down a passing motorist. The couple, identified as Jasper Collins and Amara Navarro in the police report, provided disturbing details about what they had witnessed during their brief time in Stillwater Ridge after dark. Collins described seeing figures moving between houses in a coordinated pattern, like a well-rehearsed dance, but all wrong somehow. He stated that the movements didn't look human, too fluid in some ways, too angular in others. Navarro reported that as they fled, she glanced back and saw what appeared to be residents standing in front of their homes, all perfectly still, all facing the couple's vehicle. Most disturbing was her observation that despite the considerable distance, she could clearly see that all of the observers' eyes reflected the moonlight with the same greenish glow reported years earlier by the utility worker. When police returned with the couple the following morning to retrieve their car, they found it parked neatly by the neighborhood entrance, keys in the ignition, with no mechanical issues apparent. A spokesman for the neighborhood apologized for the misunderstanding and explained that residents had simply moved the stalled vehicle out of concern it might block emergency access. Officer Daniels noted that the couple appeared unusually subdued during this interaction and later refused to discuss the incident further, even with close friends. The spokesman, identified in the report as Vincent Holloway, provided an explanation that seemed reasonable on the surface, that the community had experienced problems with vandalism in the past and had established a neighborhood watch program that was particularly active at night. He suggested that what the couple interpreted as whispering was simply residents communicating via walkie-talkies, and that the figures they saw were ordinary neighbors checking on the disturbance. When asked about the car's electrical failure, he mentioned that the neighborhood experienced occasional power fluctuations due to its distance from the main grid. Officer Daniels appeared to accept these explanations in her official report, but her personal notes, discovered after her retirement, indicated significant skepticism. She had written, "Holloway's explanations make sense individually, but collectively paint a picture too neat, too practiced." The couple's fear seemed genuine and deep, not the embarrassment of pranksters caught in the act, but the terror of people who had glimpsed something fundamentally wrong. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery made in 1969 by County Surveyor Douglas Werner, who was tasked with updating regional maps. When measuring the exact boundaries of Stillwater Ridge for official records, Werner found significant discrepancies between the original development plans and the actual layout. According to his field notes, the distance between homes was approximately 12% greater than shown on architectural drawings, while the diameter of the entire neighborhood had expanded by nearly 8% since its construction, physical impossibilities that defied explanation. Werner's measurements were precise and verified multiple times using different equipment. He documented that the physical footprint of Stillwater Ridge now occupied more space than it had when originally constructed, without any visible expansion of the road system or property boundaries. Even more concerning were his observations about the houses themselves. His notes indicate that interior measurements of several homes he was permitted to enter did not match their exterior dimensions. The inside spaces were subtly larger, with discrepancies of several inches in multiple rooms. When he attempted to discuss these findings with residents, they responded with what he described as polite dismissal, suggesting he had simply misread the original plans or made measurement errors. Werner's report suggested that either the original plans were drastically inaccurate or that substantial, undocumented structural modifications had occurred. He recommended a comprehensive review of the development's compliance with county building codes. Records indicate his recommendations were filed but never acted upon. Werner himself requested reassignment to a different county district the following week. Friends and colleagues reported that in the days following his survey of Stillwater Ridge, Werner became increasingly paranoid, installing multiple locks on his doors and covering his windows with aluminum foil. He repeatedly mentioned feeling watched and complained of hearing whispers at the edge of his perception, particularly after sunset. After his reassignment, Werner moved to another state and reportedly refused to discuss Stillwater Ridge ever again. His field equipment, high-precision surveying tools, was found abandoned at his office with a note stating simply, "Contaminated, do not use." By early 1969, local law enforcement had adopted an unofficial policy regarding Stillwater Ridge. A handwritten note discovered in the back of the department's procedural manual stated simply, "No patrols in Stillwater after sunset. Calls to be held until morning unless life-threatening. Do not override." The note had no signature or date. Yet former officers interviewed decades later confirmed this was standard practice throughout the department. This unofficial policy extended beyond police services to all emergency responders. Ambulance dispatchers were instructed to redirect nighttime calls from Stillwater Ridge to a special administrative line, where they were invariably told by a community representative that the situation would be handled internally until morning. Fire services maintained a similar protocol, responding only to confirmed structure fires and otherwise respecting what was euphemistically referred to as the community's privacy preferences. What makes these arrangements particularly disturbing is that they appear to have been established without any formal agreement or public discussion. No official documents exist authorizing special treatment for Stillwater Ridge, yet the protocols were rigorously observed across multiple county departments for decades. In spring of 1969, the case took perhaps its most unusual turn when Dr. Alexander Morgan, a professor of social anthropology at the State University, became interested in what he termed the ritualistic behavioral patterns of isolated suburban enclaves. Without explicitly naming Stillwater Ridge, his research proposal described studying a community where sunset and sunrise serve as significant socio-cultural boundaries beyond traditional timekeeping functions. University records show his project received funding in May 1969. Morgan's academic background made him uniquely qualified for such research. He had previously studied remote religious communities and isolated cultural groups that maintained distinctive practices at odds with mainstream society. His methodology typically involved long-term immersive observation, living among his subjects to document their customs and beliefs from within. For Stillwater Ridge, however, he modified his approach, recognizing that direct residency might be rejected by the community. Instead, he proposed placing a research assistant in the neighborhood as a renter, allowing for internal observation without the scrutiny that might accompany a known academic's presence. Doctor? Morgan's research methodology involved a graduate student, Maxwell Phillips, renting a room in the home of an elderly resident in Stillwater Ridge. Phillips would live as a participant observer within the community while documenting its customs and social structures. The arrangement was approved by the homeowner, Edith Lancaster, a widow who had lived in the neighborhood since its founding. According to university correspondence, Mrs. Lancaster was fully informed about the academic nature of Phillips' stay. Phillips, a promising doctoral candidate with previous fieldwork experience studying closed religious communities in rural Appalachia, was selected for his observational skills and ability to integrate into unfamiliar social environments. He underwent extensive preparation, studying what little was known about Stillwater Ridge and developing a cover identity as a graduate student in literature, working on his thesis, an explanation for his note-taking and irregular hours that seemed unlikely to arouse suspicion. For the first 2 months, Phillips submitted weekly reports describing a community that, while unusually close-knit and traditional, appeared fundamentally normal during daylight hours. He noted the precision with which residents tracked sunset times, often beginning their evening routines 30-45 minutes before actual dusk. Phillips documented elaborate dinner gatherings, community meetings, and indoor recreational activities that seemed designed to ensure everyone remained occupied and indoors throughout the night. His early reports described these patterns as consistent with a community that had developed strong social bonds through shared rituals and traditions, unusual in suburban America, but not inherently concerning from an anthropological perspective. He noted that residents spoke of their evening gatherings with pride, describing them as a way of preserving authentic community in an increasingly fragmented society. Neighbors regularly exchanged food, particularly evening meals, ensuring that all households had reason to remain home after dark. His reports grew increasingly complicated, however, as he attempted to investigate what happened after dark. In a July 1969 communication to Dr. Morgan, Phillips expressed frustration that his landlady insisted he retire to his bedroom immediately after their evening meal, and had installed an unusually secure lock on the outside of his bedroom door, allegedly for his peace of mind. He also noted that the windows in his room had been recently modified with what appeared to be metal reinforcements beneath the decorative curtains, significantly restricting their ability to open. Phillips began to notice other architectural anomalies throughout the house: doors that locked from the outside rather than the inside, windows that had been permanently sealed, and an elaborate intercom system that connected all homes in the neighborhood. Most disturbing was his observation that the basement contained what appeared to be a reinforced room with multiple locks, which Mrs. Lancaster refused to discuss when he inquired about it, simply stating that it was storage for community supplies. As July progressed, Phillips's reports documented increasingly strange behaviors among residents as sunset approached. He described a ritual he called the preparation, in which households would engage in synchronized activities beginning approximately 45 minutes before dusk. These included drawing curtains in a specific order, securing doors with multiple locks, and placing small carved objects, which he was never able to examine closely, on windowsills and thresholds. Adults would gather in living rooms to read from leather-bound books with no visible titles or markings, often reciting passages in unison with neighboring houses, audible through the unusually thin walls between homes. Phillips noted that on several occasions he observed residents consuming what appeared to be medication shortly before sunset, small dark pills that were never offered to him nor explained when he inquired about them. Phillips' final documented communication was a hastily written note slipped to a grocery delivery person on August 14, 1969. It read simply, "Something happens to them at night. Not safe. Contact Dr. Morgan immediately. Mayim." The delivery person, finding the note odd but not alarming, only remembered to mention it to authorities several weeks later when news of Phillips's disappearance became public. What the delivery person did recall, however, was an unusual interaction with Mrs. Lancaster that day. He described her as seeming different somehow, twitchy and distracted, and noted that she had insisted he complete the delivery quickly because the sun waits for no one. He also mentioned observing strange markings on her forearms that looked like bruises, but in geometric patterns, that she quickly covered when she noticed his attention. According to police reports, Mrs. Lancaster reported on August 16th that Phillips had abruptly moved out, leaving most of his belongings behind. She claimed he had received an urgent phone call and informed her he needed to attend to a family emergency. When Dr. Morgan attempted to contact his student and found the story suspicious, he reported Phillips missing. A subsequent police search of the Lancaster residence found no evidence of foul play, and Phillips's room appeared to have been thoroughly cleaned and repainted recently. Mrs. Lancaster explained that this was standard procedure between tenants. What the police report failed to mention, but was later discovered in Dr. Morgan's notes, was that the repainting had occurred within hours of Phillips's disappearance, an unusual urgency for routine maintenance. Morgan also noted that Phillips had no family emergencies that would have prompted a sudden departure, and that his wallet, identification, and research materials had all been left behind, items he would certainly have taken if planning to travel. Most concerning was the complete absence of Phillips's research journal, which he had kept meticulously throughout his stay and had described as containing observations that would revolutionize our understanding of communal behavior in his last scheduled communication with Morgan. The university suspended the research project immediately, and Dr. Morgan became increasingly vocal about his concerns regarding Stillwater Ridge. His personal journals, later discovered after his death in 1976, describe multiple attempts to interest various authorities in investigating the neighborhood more thoroughly. He wrote, "There is something fundamentally wrong with a community that maintains such rigid control over nighttime movement. This goes beyond eccentricity or privacy concerns. The consistency with which residents adhere to these restrictions suggests something beyond mere social pressure, something they genuinely fear, or perhaps something they protect." Morgan's attempts to generate official interest in the case were consistently rebuffed. Law enforcement cited lack of evidence for any actual crime, while university administrators expressed concerns about potential liability issues if they pursued investigation of a community without clear academic justification. Morgan became increasingly isolated in his concerns, with colleagues gently suggesting that his interest had crossed from professional curiosity into personal obsession. His teaching load was gradually reduced, and his research funding requests were consistently denied regardless of topic. In September 1969, Dr. Morgan attempted to conduct his own nighttime observation of Stillwater Ridge. According to his journal, he parked on the main county road approximately a quarter mile from the neighborhood entrance and used binoculars to observe from a distance. His notes from that evening describe the now familiar pattern of activities ceasing at sunset, but also include disturbing observations made approximately 3 hours after nightfall. 02:15. Observed unusual light patterns in multiple homes. Not consistent with normal residential illumination, light appears to shift and pulse with a greenish tinge. 37. Movement between houses does not follow sidewalks or paved areas. Figures appear to move directly across lawns in coordinated patterns. 3. 8. The quality of darkness within the neighborhood boundaries appears different from surrounding areas, deeper, more complete, as though the streetlights and occasional household lights are being absorbed rather than dispersed. 3. 42. A low-frequency sound becoming audible, not mechanical, more organic, pulsing in nature. or 4. 10. Something has noticed my presence, ending observation immediately. Morgan's notes include detailed sketches of what he observed, the movement patterns between houses, which he described as following geometric configurations that changed at precise intervals, and the unusual quality of the darkness, which he attempted to represent through layered shading that grew more dense toward the center of the neighborhood. Most disturbing were his attempts to transcribe the sounds he heard, not in conventional musical notation, but in a series of overlapping wave patterns that he described as voices speaking in harmony, but at frequencies just beyond human vocal capacity. There is no record of what Dr. Morgan might have seen that prompted his abrupt departure. His journal entries over the subsequent days become increasingly paranoid, describing being followed by community representatives and receiving unexplained phone calls with no one on the line. He requested a leave of absence from the university the following week and temporarily relocated to his sister's home in another state. When he returned to his university position 3 months later, he abandoned his research into Stillwater Ridge entirely and refused to discuss it with colleagues. Friends and family reported significant personality changes following his nighttime observation. The once gregarious and enthusiastic researcher became withdrawn and hypervigilant, installing elaborate security systems in his home and refusing to go out after dark regardless of the occasion. He began sleeping during daylight hours and spending nights fully awake with all lights on, a pattern he maintained until his death 7 years later. His medical records indicate he sought psychiatric treatment for severe insomnia and what was diagnosed as acute stress reaction, but he reportedly refused to discuss the specific triggers with his therapists, saying only that some knowledge can't be unknown once you've seen it. By the end of 1969, public records concerning Stillwater Ridge become notably sparse. The neighborhood successfully petitioned the county to have their access road reclassified as a private drive, effectively limiting the public's right to enter without specific invitation. Tax records continued to show normal property assessments and payments, but the community's interaction with outside authorities diminished significantly. Building permits, typically required for structural modifications, were filed with decreasing frequency despite satellite imagery showing ongoing construction activity within the neighborhood. The community became increasingly isolated, with fewer and fewer documented interactions with the outside world. By 1975, no residents from Stillwater Ridge maintained any visible presence in public records, having withdrawn entirely into what appeared to be a self-contained society operating according to its own rules and rhythms. One final documented incident deserves mention. In December 1969, a medical emergency was reported at the home of Walter and Patricia Sutton on Elm Circle within Stillwater Ridge. Walter, aged 37, had suffered a severe allergic reaction requiring immediate medical attention. The call to emergency services was placed at 5:45 p.m., approximately 30 minutes after local sunset. According to ambulance dispatch logs, the responding unit arrived at the neighborhood entrance at 6:12 p.m., but was stopped by a group of residents who insisted on transferring the patient to their vehicle at the boundary line, rather than allowing the ambulance to enter. The EMT report describes the patient as conscious but disoriented, and notes that he resisted transfer while repeatedly stating that it wasn't time yet. Most disturbing was the EMT's observation that the residents who brought Walter to the ambulance exhibited unusual physical movements and abnormal speech patterns, and departed with unnatural haste back into the neighborhood immediately upon transferring the patient. The medical technicians noted that despite the winter temperature hovering around 28 degrees, the residents wore no coats or appropriate cold weather clothing, yet showed no signs of discomfort. They also documented that the residents moved in perfect synchronization when returning to their vehicles. like dancers following choreography, and that their speech had a distinctive rhythm and cadence that made comprehension difficult despite using recognizable words. Most concerning was their observation that Walter appeared to be undergoing physiological changes beyond what would be expected from an allergic reaction. His skin had developed a faint greenish pallor, and his eyes displayed unusual dilation patterns that the attending physician later described as inconsistent with any known medical condition. Ihoile. Walter Sutton was treated for anaphylaxis at County General Hospital and released the following day. Hospital records indicate he was collected by his wife at 10:30 a.m. There is no further medical history for any member of the Sutton family in county records after this date, suggesting they either relocated or began seeking medical care well outside their home region. The attending physician, Dr. Elaine Cartwright, made several unusual notes in Walter's file, including observations about his rapid recovery, which she described as exceeding normal physiological parameters, and blood work results that she noted contained anomalous cellular structures requiring further investigation. She requested follow-up testing, but the Suttons never returned for the scheduled appointment. Dr. Cartwright reportedly attempted to contact them directly, even driving to Stillwater Ridge during daylight hours, but was informed by neighbors that the family had temporarily relocated for health reasons. Most disturbing was her personal notation, found in her research journal years later, that the blood samples taken from Walter had been discovered missing from the lab the morning after his treatment, with no record of who had accessed them or where they had been taken. The case of Stillwater Ridge faded from official attention after 1969. Subsequent decades show property transfers continuing at normal intervals, tax payments remaining current, and no significant interactions with law enforcement. Aerial photographs from regional surveys conducted in the 1970s and 1980s show the physical layout of the neighborhood remaining consistent, though with a notably denser tree canopy gradually encroaching on its perimeter. What these official records fail to capture, however, are the persistent local legends and rumors that continued to surround the community. Residents of neighboring towns reported occasional sightings of Stillwater Ridge residents in public spaces, always during daylight hours, always exhibiting what was described as unusual reserve in social interactions. Local businesses noted that residents typically conducted transactions with minimal conversation, often using cash rather than credit cards or checks that would create paper trails. Delivery services reported that drivers assigned to Stillwater Ridge repeatedly requested route changes, citing vague, bad feelings about the neighborhood without specific complaints. Most telling was the gradual development of unspoken local knowledge. Drivers and visitors were warned to avoid the area after dark, real estate agents steering potential buyers toward other neighborhoods despite comparable housing prices, and long-term residents developing elaborate explanations for the community's peculiarities that they shared with newcomers as part of unofficial welcome to the area conversations. A 1994 highway expansion project that would have created a secondary access road near Stillwater Ridge was abandoned after engineering surveys found unexpected geological instabilities in the proposed corridor. The project's chief engineer noted in his final report that ground-penetrating radar revealed unusual substructure patterns extending outward from the neighborhood that made the area unsuitable for major construction. Alternative routes were developed that left Stillwater Ridge with its single access road intact. What the public report didn't mention, but was later revealed through Freedom of Information Act requests, was that the survey equipment had experienced consistent malfunctions when operating within a half-mile radius of Stillwater Ridge. The raw data from functioning equipment showed what one geologist described as impossible density variations in the subsurface, with patterns that seemed to pulse and shift between consecutive scans rather than remaining stable as would be expected from geological formations. Most concerning was the discovery of what appeared to be hollow spaces extending beneath the entire neighborhood at depths ranging from 30 to 100 feet, not natural cave formations, but seemingly engineered chambers with regular dimensions and connecting passages that extended well beyond the neighborhood's surface boundaries. Perhaps most telling is what happened in 2003, when a cellular communications company attempted to lease land near Stillwater Ridge for a transmission tower. Company records show that their standard notification letters to nearby residents were returned unopened, while their representatives reported an inability to make contact with anyone in the neighborhood, despite multiple attempts during business hours. The company eventually selected an alternative site after their surveyor reported equipment malfunctions when working near the neighborhood boundary. Internal communications, later leaked by a former employee, indicated that the company's electromagnetic field measurements had detected unusual energy patterns emanating from beneath Stillwater Ridge, fluctuations that engineers described as unlike any known telecommunication interference and that appeared to intensify after sunset. Most concerning was the progressive equipment failure experienced by the survey team, with increasingly sophisticated instruments malfunctioning as they approached the neighborhood boundary, culminating in the complete failure of a military-grade spectrum analyzer designed to operate in extreme conditions. The company's final site assessment simply stated, "Location unsuitable due to persistent electromagnetic anomalies of unknown origin. Alternative sites recommended." In reviewing this case from our present perspective, several questions remain unanswered. What was the original purpose of Ordinance 37B? And why did residents so rigorously enforce a rule that limited their own freedom of movement? What happened to those who violated the nighttime boundary? Were they victims of criminal activity? Or is there truth to the more disturbing theories that emerged in later years? Most importantly, does Stillwater Ridge still exist in its original form, or has it transformed into something else entirely? These questions are complicated by the systematic way in which information about the community has been obscured or eliminated over decades. Public records have been minimized. Witnesses have disappeared or become unwilling to speak, and official investigations have been consistently redirected or abandoned before reaching substantive conclusions. What remains is a patchwork of observations, incidents, and anomalies that collectively suggest something fundamentally wrong exists in Stillwater Ridge, something that emerges after dark and has gradually extended its influence beyond the neighborhood's physical boundaries. County tax records confirm that the 42 original addresses in Stillwater Ridge continue to receive and pay annual property assessments. Utility usage follows seasonal patterns consistent with normal residential occupation. Yet no resident of Stillwater Ridge has been conclusively identified in public records outside the neighborhood since approximately 1986. No new residents appear in voting records despite property tax payments remaining current. This administrative ghostliness, the maintenance of legal existence without visible community participation, represents perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the case from a sociological perspective. It suggests an entity capable of navigating bureaucratic requirements while systematically minimizing human interaction, maintaining a facade of normality through documentation while the actual community operates according to entirely different parameters than those officially acknowledged. The last documented attempt to investigate Stillwater Ridge occurred in 2005, when a documentary filmmaker named Sebastian Reed became interested in local urban legends. According to production notes found in his abandoned apartment, Reed had collected anecdotal stories about the neighborhood from longtime residents of surrounding communities. His research led him to many of the same historical records cited here, plus interviews with retired county employees who remembered the unusual protocols surrounding the neighborhood. Reed's production journal indicates a progressive fascination with Stillwater Ridge, describing it as the perfect subject, a real-life mystery hiding in plain sight, with enough documented anomalies to suggest something genuine beneath the rumors. He outlined an ambitious production plan, including historical research, interviews with former officials, and on-site filming to capture the physical reality of the neighborhood in contrast to its documentation. His notes reveal increasing difficulty finding willing interview subjects as his research progressed, with many initially interested parties subsequently declining participation after further consideration. Reed's production diary indicates he made 3 daytime visits to Stillwater Ridge in early 2005, each time finding the neighborhood apparently deserted despite cars in driveways and other signs of occupation. On his 4th visit, according to his notes, he was approached by a middle-aged man who identified himself only as a community representative. Their conversation, which Reed recorded surreptitiously, included the man explaining that Stillwater Ridge was a private community for individuals with extreme sensitivity to outside stimuli, and that residents operated on an inverted schedule for medical reasons, remaining indoors during daylight hours. The representative's explanation seemed plausible on the surface. A community of individuals with severe photosensitivity or similar medical conditions might reasonably maintain unusual schedules and privacy protocols. What made the interaction disturbing, according to Reed's notes, was the representative's affect, which he described as perfectly calibrated to appear normal while feeling deeply wrong, noting that the man maintained unbroken eye contact throughout their conversation and spoke with a cadence that seemed designed to be hypnotic. Most concerning was Reed's observation that despite claiming to be sensitive to daylight, the man showed no discomfort standing in direct sunlight during their conversation. Not even the automatic squinting one would expect from ordinary light sensitivity. When Reed pressed for more specific information, the representative allegedly stated, "We maintain our boundaries for everyone's protection, yours as much as ours. Some separations exist for very good reasons, Mr. Reed. I strongly suggest you respect this one." Reed's notes indicate the man knew his name despite Reed never having introduced himself. Following this encounter, Reed's journal entries show increasing paranoia, describing electronic interference affecting his equipment, phone calls with no one on the line, and the sensation of being observed in his home. He wrote about taking increased security precautions, including changing his routine and sleeping at friends' homes. Despite these concerns, his determination to document Stillwater Ridge appeared to intensify rather than diminish. The final entry in Reed's production diary, dated March 17, 2005, describes his plan to conduct an overnight surveillance of Stillwater Ridge using a telephoto lens and infrared equipment from a concealed position in the surrounding woods. An equipment rental agreement found among his possessions confirms he obtained the necessary gear. Reed was reported missing by his landlord after 3 months of absence and unpaid rent. His vehicle was never recovered, and his case remains open in county files. Most disturbing was the condition of his apartment when investigators finally gained access. Despite being abandoned for months, it showed signs of recent thorough cleaning. His research materials, including interviews, historical documents, and production notes, were missing entirely. Only his personal journal remained, hidden inside a hollowed-out book on his shelf, apparently overlooked during whatever removal operation had occurred. The final pages contained increasingly frantic entries, including sketches of geometric patterns he claimed to see at the edge of perception and repeated references to greenish light, where there shouldn't be any. His final coherent sentence reads, "I understand now why no one comes back from watching after dark. Some things can't be unseen, and once they notice you noticing them, they don't let go." Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Stillwater Ridge case is how effectively the community has maintained its isolation despite decades of suburban expansion in surrounding areas. Development plans from 2010 show new housing communities approaching within a half-mile of Stillwater Ridge's boundaries, yet satellite imagery confirms that a distinct perimeter of undeveloped land remains intact around the neighborhood, a perfect circle of dense forest that has somehow resisted the region's otherwise aggressive growth. Environmental surveys have noted unusual characteristics in this buffer zone: plant species that typically don't thrive in the local climate, abnormal growth patterns in trees, and a notable absence of wildlife compared to similar woodland areas. Soil samples show elevated levels of minerals not commonly found in the region, particularly compounds containing rare earth elements typically associated with technological applications rather than natural occurrence. Most telling is the gradual but measurable expansion of this buffer zone over decades, with vegetation demonstrating the unusual characteristics extending approximately 3 to 5 meters further from the neighborhood's center each year, a pattern that, if continued, would eventually bring whatever anomalous influence exists in Stillwater Ridge into direct contact with neighboring communities. What historical records fail to explain, however, is the origin of the community's unusual restrictions. Local historian Josephine Hayes, who spent years researching Stillwater Ridge, discovered several unusual facts about the land prior to development. According to her unpublished manuscript found among her possessions after her death in 2012, the land where Stillwater Ridge was built had been deliberately avoided by indigenous tribes for centuries. Early settler accounts from the 1790s described the area as unnaturally quiet and noted that local wildlife seemed to avoid it, particularly after sunset. Hayes' manuscript included translations of symbols found on pre-colonial artifacts discovered near the site, which indigenous language experts had interpreted as warnings about a place where the boundary thins and those who walk in darkness emerge. The location had various names in different tribal languages, but all shared common thematic elements related to liminality, transformation, and danger specifically associated with darkness. Hayes's research uncovered a journal entry from 1837 written by a surveyor named Caleb Thornton, who had been tasked with mapping the region for potential farming development. His notes describe spending a night camped in what would later become Stillwater Ridge. There is a peculiar quality to the darkness here. The stars seem dimmer, as though viewed through murky water. Shortly after midnight, I became aware of movement in the surrounding woods, not the usual nocturnal creatures, but something else entirely. The sounds were wrong. The way they moved was wrong. I kept my lantern burning until dawn and will not be returning to this accursed place. Thornton's subsequent surveying work deliberately excluded the area that would become Stillwater Ridge, marking it on his maps only as unsuitable for settlement without further explanation. His personal correspondence, which Hayes discovered in a distant relative's collection, revealed that he suffered from persistent nightmares and insomnia following his night in the woods, eventually relocating to another state entirely to escape what he described as the persistent feeling of being followed by something that emerges only after sunset. Most significant in Hayes's findings was the discovery that Meridian Housing Corporation, which developed Stillwater Ridge in 1954, was not a typical construction company. Her research suggests it was essentially a shell company created by a group calling themselves the Custodians of the Boundary. According to documents she uncovered in private collections, this group had monitored the area for generations before orchestrating its development as a residential community. Their correspondence suggests they believed that building homes on the site would stabilize the fluctuations and provide the necessary physical anchors for containment. The custodians appeared to have connections to various esoteric societies and research organizations throughout the early 20th century, with membership including individuals from scientific, military, and occult backgrounds. Their internal documents repeatedly referenced a thinning that had been accelerating since approximately 1920, necessitating more direct intervention than their previous strategy of simply keeping the area uninhabited. Most concerning were references to acceptable sacrifices and necessary transformations that would be required of residents, suggesting that those who purchased homes in Stillwater Ridge may not have understood the community's true purpose or what would ultimately be expected of them. Hayes's manuscript includes a disturbing theory about Ordinance 37B. She believed it was not designed to keep residents in at night, but rather to ensure they were safely indoors when whatever existed beyond the neighborhood boundary became active after dark. Her note suggests that the custodians deliberately populated Stillwater Ridge with families who would be receptive to certain accommodations necessary for living there, people who, for various reasons, would accept unusual restrictions in exchange for affordable housing in an exclusive community. Sales records she examined showed that many original buyers had connections to organizations associated with the custodians or had family members who had participated in esoteric research during the 1930s and 1940s. She theorized that these families understood at least partially what they were agreeing to, forming a core community that would maintain traditions and enforce rules as needed. Later buyers, she suggested, were carefully screened for suggestibility and adaptability, with preference given to those who demonstrated interest in fringe science, spiritual practices, or communal living arrangements. The manuscript ends abruptly in mid-sentence. According to the coroner's report, Hayes died of an apparent stroke while working at her desk. Her relatives reported that in the weeks before her death, she had complained of strange phone calls and the sensation of being watched. The manuscript was never published, and the research materials she had collected vanished from her office before police arrived to investigate her death. Most disturbing was the statement from her assistant, who discovered the body, that Hayes's final expression was not one of pain or surprise as might be expected from a stroke victim, but rather perfect clarity, as though she had finally understood something she had been puzzling over for years. The assistant also reported finding a single sentence written in Hayes's journal, apparently moments before her death. They're not containing something beneath Stillwater Ridge. They're cultivating it. As night falls across the country that contains what remains of Stillwater Ridge, one has to wonder what transpires behind those identical facades when darkness provides cover. Do the residents still observe their strange ordinance with the same dedication as their predecessors? Has whatever they feared, or perhaps protected, grown stronger over the decades of isolation? The answers remain elusive, hidden behind the silent agreement that keeps outsiders firmly on their side of an invisible boundary, and whatever exists within Stillwater Ridge contained until sunrise, until perhaps that containment eventually fails. The sun is setting now as I conclude this account, and somewhere, in a circular neighborhood with a single access road, residents are surely securing their doors and windows, drawing their curtains tight, and preparing for another long night of darkness, thicker than it should be, filled with whispers that human voices should not be able to produce, and movement that human bodies should not be capable of making. Sleep well tonight. And if you happen to live near a community where no one ever seems to leave after dark, perhaps it would be wise not to look too closely at what happens there when the sun goes down. Some boundaries exist for a reason, and some neighborhoods harbor secrets that are best left undisturbed, particularly after dark.